The late afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of the Grand Palace Hotel's ballroom, casting golden light across the polished floor where Richard Hall stood surrounded by admirers. At 42, Richard had spent the last 20 years building his reputation as one of the most skilled concert pianists in the world. His hands, with long fingers that could stretch to hit impossible chord combinations, moved expressively as he described his recent tour through Europe. Vienna was particularly moving, he said, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. The acoustics at the Musikverein are unmatched. When I finished the Rachmaninoff, you could hear a pin drop before the applause started. The small crowd around him nodded appreciatively. Richard had grown used to this kind of attention since his career took off in his early 20s. Coming back to his hometown of Millfield for the annual music festival felt almost like slumming it. But his agent had insisted it would be good publicity. The hometown hero returns. "Will you play the Rachmaninoff at the festival?" asked an older woman wearing too much perfume. Richard shook his head. "I've prepared something more accessible for the local audience." He didn't mention that his usual fee had been doubled to secure his participation. The festival organizers had been pursuing him for years, and he'd finally agreed. Partly out of boredom and partly because a critic had recently suggested he was becoming predictable in his choice of venues. As he was about to elaborate on his program selection, a ripple of piano notes floated through the open doors from the adjoining room. Richard paused mid-sentence, his trained ear immediately recognizing Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2, one of his signature pieces. "Excuse me," he said to his admirers, not waiting for a response before moving toward the music. The adjacent room was smaller, with a baby grand piano positioned near the window. A woman sat at the keys, her back straight but not stiff, her dark hair falling in a simple cut that brushed her shoulders. Her hands moved with confident precision across the keys, tackling the notoriously difficult piece with apparent ease. Richard leaned against the door frame, his expression darkening as he watched. She was good, technically proficient certainly, but there was something in her interpretation that bothered him. She took liberties with the tempo that he would never allow himself, adding emotional flourishes where traditionalists like himself believed the composer's original intentions should be honored precisely. Two festival committee members stood nearby, watching with obvious appreciation. "Who is she?" Richard asked, approaching them quietly. "That's Lily Tran," whispered Barbara Collins, the festival chairperson. "She teaches piano at the community center and gives lessons privately." "Remarkable talent, isn't she?" Richard made a non-committal sound. "She's taking significant liberties with the composition." Barbara looked surprised. "Really? I thought it was beautiful." "Beautiful isn't always correct," Richard replied. "That piece requires disciplined technique. The emotional interpretation should come from playing it exactly as written, not from adding personal flourishes." The other committee member, a balding man whose name Richard couldn't remember, chuckled. "Well, not everyone can tour internationally like you, Richard. For a local teacher, she's quite impressive." Richard bristled at what he perceived as condescension toward his own achievements. That's precisely the problem. Amateurs shouldn't attempt pieces beyond their understanding. It's like someone who's read a few medical books trying to perform surgery. His voice had risen slightly and a few heads turned. The woman at the piano, Lily, continued playing, either unaware of or unbothered by their conversation. As the final notes of the piece rang out, the small gathering in the room applauded enthusiastically. Lily turned on the bench, a modest smile on her face that faded slightly when she noticed Richard staring at her with undisguised criticism. She stood and smoothed the front of her simple blue dress, nothing like the designer, clothes that filled Richard's wardrobe for performances. That was absolutely wonderful. "Lily," Barbara gushed, moving forward to take her hands. "Everyone, this is Lily Tran, who will be performing with her advanced students during the community showcase on Thursday." Richard watched as Lily thanked Barbara with genuine warmth. There was no pretension in her manner, which somehow irritated him even more. In his experience, talent usually came with ego. He considered his own entirely justified. "Richard, come meet Lily," Barbara called, waving him over. With the practiced smile he used for donors and patrons, Richard approached and extended his hand. "Richard Hall." "I know who you are, Mr. Hall," Lily said, her voice softer than he expected but not timid. Your recording of Beethoven's Emperor Concerto helped me through a difficult time in my life. It's an honor to meet you. Richard noted her firm handshake and direct gaze. Most people were either overly fawning when they met him or pretended his fame didn't impress them. Her simple acknowledgement was refreshingly straightforward. You play enthusiastically, he said, unable to offer genuine praise but unwilling to be openly rude in front of the committee members. Lily's eyes flickered with something, recognition of his veiled criticism, perhaps, but her smile remained. The list is a challenging piece, she said. I'm still working on sections of it. Indeed. Perhaps some pieces should be left to those with the training to do them justice. A small silence followed his remark. Barbara looked uncomfortable, while the balding man raised his eyebrows. Lily tilted her head slightly. Music belongs to everyone, Mr. Hall. Different interpretations are what keep classical pieces alive rather than preserved in amber. Richard felt heat rise in his neck. Who was this local piano teacher to lecture him on music? Interpretation requires understanding the composer's intent, he replied coolly. That comes from years of dedicated study and performance experience. Of course, Lily agreed with a nod. Though I believe Liszt himself was known for his emotional, rather than technically perfect playing. His contemporaries often criticized him for the same liberties I probably just took. Several people around them chuckled, and Richard felt the conversation slipping away from him. He was unaccustomed to being challenged, especially by someone he viewed as an amateur. Perhaps we should let the audience decide which approach serves the music better, he said suddenly, the words coming out before he'd fully considered them. A piano duel of sorts. The same piece played by both of us during the festival. Barbara's eyes widened. That's not on the program, Richard. I'm sure adjustments can be made, Richard said dismissively. Unless Ms. Tran prefers to keep her playing confined to students in community centers. He saw something flash in Lily's eyes. Not anger. Exactly. But determination. I wouldn't presume to share a stage with someone of your caliber. Mr. Hall, she said carefully, but if the committee thinks it would add something valuable to the festival, I wouldn't decline. Richard hadn't expected her to accept. He'd assumed she would back down, making some excuse about not being prepared or not wanting to compete. Her quiet confidence unsettled him. Barbara looked between them, clearly sensing the tension but also recognizing a potential highlight for the festival. It could be quite special, she said slowly. Not a competition exactly, but a demonstration of different approaches to the same piece. We could schedule it for Saturday evening before Richard's solo performance. Perfect, Richard said, his competitive nature fully engaged now. The Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2, then. Unless that's too challenging? Lily met his gaze steadily. That would be fine. Though perhaps we should each also play a piece of our own choosing, to showcase our personal styles. Even better, Barbara interjected before Richard could respond. This is exciting. I'll have to rework some things, but I think we can make it happen. As the conversation shifted to logistics, Richard found himself watching Lily more closely. There was nothing remarkable about her appearance. Pretty in an understated way, with clear skin and expressive eyes, but not the type to turn heads when entering a room. Yet there was a quiet dignity in her posture, and a confidence that didn't need to announce itself. I look forward to Saturday, then, Lily said to Richard as she prepared to leave. Thank you for the opportunity. The phrasing irritated him. She made it sound as if he were doing her a favor rather than issuing a challenge. Don't thank me yet, he replied with a thin smile. The festival audience deserves to hear these pieces played properly. She held his gaze for a moment before nodding once. Everyone deserves good music, Mr. Hall. That's something we can agree on. As she left with Barbara to discuss the details, Richard turned back to the reception, already imagining how he would demonstrate the proper technique and interpretation on Saturday. He would show everyone the difference between an enthusiastic amateur and a true master. What he didn't notice was the way several people watched Lily leave with expressions of admiration, or how the balding committee member shook his head slightly after she'd gone. You might have just created the highlight of the festival, the man said to Richard, though perhaps not in the way you intended. Richard dismissed the comment with a wave of his hand. Saturday couldn't come soon enough. The news of the piano duel spread quickly through Millfield. By the next morning, Richard was already fielding calls from his agent, who was torn between annoyance at the schedule change and excitement about the publicity potential. "Just make sure you don't humiliate her too badly," his agent said over the phone. "Small-town pride and all that. Maybe let her have one good moment before you show your stuff." Richard scoffed as he looked out the window of his hotel suite. "That won't be necessary. She'll be lucky if she doesn't freeze under the pressure." After hanging up, Richard decided he should at least learn something about his impromptu opponent. A quick internet search revealed little. A basic website for her piano lessons, a few mentions in local newspaper articles about community concerts, and a photo of her with a group of children seated at keyboards in what looked like a community center. Nothing impressive. Nothing that suggested she'd ever performed anywhere that mattered. Richard closed his laptop and stretched. He had planned to use the days before his performance to relax, maybe play some golf at the country club where his old high school music teacher had offered to host him. Now he would need to polish his Hungarian Rhapsody, though he wasn't particularly worried. He'd performed it dozens of times to critical acclaim. For his choice piece, he decided on Chopin's Revolutionary Etude. It would provide the perfect contrast to Liszt, equally difficult but with a different emotional quality that would showcase his range. Plus, its speed and intensity would surely overshadow whatever safe, middle difficulty piece Lily would choose. Richard spent a leisurely hour at the piano in his suite that afternoon, running through scales to warm up before playing sections of both pieces. They were already in his muscle memory. No need to overdo the preparation. Across town, Lily sat at the upright piano in her small apartment, her fingers moving deliberately through the most challenging passages of the Hungarian Rhapsody. A worn metronome clicked steadily beside her, and sheets of music marked with her own notations were spread across the piano top. The phone rang, interrupting her practice. It was Barbara from the festival committee. "Lily, are you sure about this?" Barbara asked without preamble. "Richard Hall is, well, he's not just good, he's world-class, and he can be quite cutting when he feels challenged." Lily smiled to herself. "I noticed. But it's not about winning for me, Barbara. It's a chance to play at the main festival instead of just the community showcase. My students will be thrilled." "About that," Barbara said, her voice brightening. "Ticket requests have tripled since word got out about the Duel. We're moving Saturday's event to the main concert hall. It seems everyone wants to see David take on Goliath." After she hung up, Lily returned to her practice with renewed focus. The bigger venue meant better acoustics but also more pressure. She hadn't performed in a space that large since before she'd come back home. A knock at her door pulled her away from the piano again. It was Tom, the elderly man from the apartment next door, holding a casserole dish. "Heard about your big showdown with the famous pianist," he said, handing her the dish. "Beth and I thought you might be too busy practicing to cook." Lily accepted the dish with genuine gratitude. "You didn't have to do that, Tom." "Course we did. Whole building's rooting for you. That guy needs to be taken down a peg or two, if you ask me. Coming back here acting like he's better than everyone." "He is better than everyone," Lily said, laughing softly. "At least technically." Tom shook his head. "There's more to music than being technically perfect. Beth still talks about that time you played at her sister's funeral. Says she never heard Amazing Grace sound so meaningful." After Tom left, Lily ate a small portion of the casserole before returning to her practice. As the evening deepened into night, she shifted from the Hungarian Rhapsody to her choice piece, Debussy's Clair de Lune. Not as technically showy as what Richard would likely choose, but it was a piece that allowed her to express something beyond the notes on the page. When her fingers finally grew too tired to continue, Lily picked up her phone and dialed a familiar number. "It's late there," said the voice that answered. "Everything okay?" "I'm sorry, Professor Chen," Lily said. "I didn't check the time. For my favorite student, any time is fine. Tell me what's happening." Lily explained the situation with Richard and the upcoming duel. Her former teacher listened without interrupting. "You could beat him, you know," Professor Chen said when she finished. "You have the technical skill." "Had," Lily corrected. "It's been years since I practiced 6 hours a day. Some things the body doesn't forget." "But that's not why you called me at midnight." Lily sighed. "I guess I wanted reassurance that I didn't make a mistake walking away from that career." "Do you think you made a mistake?" "No," Lily answered without hesitation. "Coming back to care for Mom was the right choice. And I love teaching, but sometimes I wonder what might have been. Perhaps this duel is your chance to find out," Professor Chen suggested. "Not to change your path, but to confirm it." They talked a while longer, with Professor Chen offering technical advice for both pieces. Before they hung up, he added, "Remember what I always told you. Technique opens the door, but heart fills the room." The next day, the local paper ran a front-page story about the upcoming piano duel. Richard was pleased to see his name in large print and a flattering photo from his last album cover. Lily was mentioned as local piano teacher Lily Tran, with a much smaller photo taken at what appeared to be a student recital. He spent the morning answering emails and then decided to visit the festival venue to check the piano he'd be playing. The festival coordinator met him there, eager to accommodate his requests. "Will Miss Tran be coming to test the piano as well?" Richard asked casually as he adjusted the height of the bench. "She was here at 6 this morning," the coordinator replied. "Said she didn't want to interfere with your schedule." Richard raised an eyebrow but made no comment. He played a few passages, testing the action of the keys and the resonance. It was a decent Steinway, though not as responsive as the instruments he was used to. "I'll need it tuned again before Saturday," he said, "and the lid should be on the long stick, not the short one." After leaving the venue, Richard decided to have lunch at a small cafe downtown. As he waited for his order, he overheard two women at the next table discussing the upcoming duel. "I've heard Lily is really something special," one said. "My daughter takes lessons from her. Says she's the best teacher she's ever had because she makes them feel the music, not just play the notes." "Didn't she go to some fancy music school?" the other asked. "I think so, years ago. She came back to take care of her mother when she got sick. Turned down something big from what I heard." Richard found himself listening more intently. "What a shame," the first woman said. "Though the kids around here are lucky. Did you know she teaches at the center for free every Saturday? Those kids would never get music lessons otherwise." Their conversation shifted to other topics, but Richard sat with his thoughts for a moment. The idea that Lily might have formal training beyond local schools hadn't occurred to him. Still, he reassured himself, caring for family and teaching children didn't prepare someone for a professional stage. Later that afternoon, Richard was practicing in his hotel suite when his phone rang again. It was Barbara. "Richard, there's been a change in plans," she said, sounding excited. "The duel has generated so much interest that we've had to move it to the Millfield Concert Hall. It seats 800 and we're nearly sold out already." Richard smiled to himself. This was turning into quite the event. "That's fine, Barbara. I'm used to much larger venues." "Of course," she replied quickly. "Also, the local TV station wants to interview both you and Lily tomorrow. Would 11 a.m. work?" The idea of a joint interview was less appealing, but Richard agreed. Publicity was publicity. "One more thing," Barbara added. "The order for Saturday. We thought it would be best if each of you played your choice piece first, then the Hungarian Rhapsody." "And who plays first?" Richard asked, knowing the advantage of playing last when the audience's impression would be freshest. "We flipped a coin," Barbara said. "Lily will play first." Perfect, Richard thought. He'd have the final word. After hanging up, he returned to the piano, running through the revolutionary etude at 3/4 speed. His confidence grew with each note. Saturday would be a reminder to everyone in Millfield, including himself, of why he had succeeded where so many others had failed. What Richard didn't realize was that across town, in her small apartment filled with the sound of Debussy, Lily was preparing not to win a competition, but to share something honest and true, the very thing that had once made her professors predict a brilliant career before life led her down a different path. The morning of the piano duel arrived with unexpected fanfare. The local newspaper featured a side-by-side comparison of Richard and Lily on the front page, though the article heavily favored Richard's impressive international career. A small note mentioned that Lily had once attended Juilliard before returning home for personal reasons, a fact that made Richard pause over his breakfast coffee. Juilliard. That explained some things, though not why she'd walk away from the potential such training provided. Richard had turned down a place there himself, opting instead for the Royal Academy in London, but he knew the caliber of musicians the school produced. He set down the newspaper and checked his phone. 3 messages from his agent, one from Barbara confirming tonight's schedule, and surprisingly, one from his old piano teacher, Dr. Wilson, who still taught at the local high school. "Looking forward to seeing you play tonight. Don't underestimate Lily Tran. She was my student 2 years before you." Richard frowned at this unexpected connection. Why hadn't anyone mentioned this before? He felt a flicker of annoyance at being kept in the dark, though it changed nothing about tonight. If anything, it made victory even more important, to prove Dr. Wilson had backed the right student in the end. Across town, Lily woke early after a restless night. The weight of what she'd agreed to had finally settled on her shoulders. It wasn't just playing in front of a crowd, she did that regularly at student recitals and community events. It was returning to the level of performance she'd left behind years ago, and doing it opposite someone who had continued on that path to its highest reaches. She made herself tea and toast, then sat at her piano. Rather than practice, she simply placed her hands on the keys without pressing them, feeling their cool, smooth surfaces beneath her fingertips. She closed her eyes and played both pieces in her mind, visualizing each movement, each transition, each emotional peak. Her phone buzzed with a text from Anita, one of her adult students. We're all coming tonight. The community center kids made you good luck cards. No pressure, but you're representing all of us regular folks against the music elite. Lily smiled despite her nerves. Whatever happened tonight, she had something Richard didn't, a community that cared about her as a person, not just a performer. By early evening, the Millfield concert hall was buzzing with anticipation. Richard arrived through the stage door, dressed in a tailored black suit that had been pressed by the hotel staff that morning. He was surprised to find the green room already occupied. Lily sat in a corner chair, eyes closed, hands moving slightly in her lap, silently practicing. She wore a simple but elegant dark blue dress, nothing flashy but appropriate for the occasion. She looked up as he entered. "Good evening, Mr. Hall." "Ms. Tran." Richard nodded, setting down his leather portfolio case. "I read you attended Juilliard," she nodded. "For 3 years. And yet you teach piano to children in a community center." Something flickered across her face. Not embarrassment, as he might have expected, but a quiet resolve. "Yes, I do." Her simple answer, without explanation or defense, irritated him somehow. Before he could respond, Barbara bustled in. "Full house," she exclaimed. "We've even set up a video feed to the reception hall for the overflow. This is the biggest event we've had since the symphony orchestra visited 5 years ago." She handed them each a printed program. Richard noted with satisfaction that his biography took up nearly a full page, while Lily's was just a short paragraph. 10 minutes, Barbara said before hurrying out again. They sat in silence for a moment before Lily spoke. "I want to thank you, Mr. Hall." Richard looked at her with surprise. "For what?" "For this opportunity. Whatever happens tonight, it's been good for me to prepare for a performance like this again. It's reminded me of some things I'd forgotten." Before he could respond, the stagehand knocked and called, "Places? Please." The audience quieted as Barbara stepped onto the stage to introduce the evening's unique event. Richard watched from the wings as she explained the format. Each pianist would play their selected piece, followed by both performing the Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2. She introduced Lily first, who walked onto the stage with a quiet confidence that surprised Richard. The audience's applause was enthusiastic. Clearly, she had supporters in the crowd. Lily bowed simply, then took her seat at the piano. Richard watched as she closed her eyes for just a moment, took a breath, and began to play Debussy's Clair de Lune. The opening notes floated into the concert hall with a delicacy that immediately captured the audience's attention. Richard had heard the piece countless times, had even played it himself in his younger days, but there was something in Lily's interpretation that made him listen more closely. She didn't play it as a showpiece, but as a conversation, each phrase connecting to the next with a natural flow that made the familiar piece sound newly discovered. When she reached the climax, her body swayed slightly with the crescendo, her face reflecting the music's emotion without theatrics. The hall was utterly silent except for the piano. As she returned to the piece's gentle conclusion, Richard found himself leaning forward, drawn in despite himself. The final notes hung in the air like a held breath. Then the audience erupted in applause. Richard straightened his tie and rolled his shoulders. Lily's performance had been good, better than he'd expected, but nothing that would challenge his standing. His revolutionary etude would show the difference between a competent pianist and a world-class one. Lily stood, bowed gracefully, and walked off stage. She gave Richard a small smile as she passed him in the wings. "Beautiful tone," he admitted, surprising himself. "Thank you," she replied, then added, "Good luck." Richard strode onto the stage with the confidence of someone who had performed in the world's greatest concert halls. The applause was respectful, but not as warm as it had been for Lily. He knew most of the audience were locals who had come to support one of their own, but he would win them over with his playing. He launched into the revolutionary etude with precision and power. His left hand delivered the rumbling bass line with perfect articulation, while his right hand flew across the keys in the rapid runs that made this piece so technically challenging. He attacked the difficult passages with practiced skill, never missing a note, never losing the driving rhythm. Richard was conscious of creating a deliberate contrast to Lily's gentler Debussy. Where she had been water, he would be fire. Where she had whispered, he would thunder. Each challenging passage was an opportunity to demonstrate his superior technique, built through decades of rigorous practice and performance. He finished with a flourish, hands rising dramatically from the keyboard as the final chord resonated through the hall. The applause was immediate and impressed. Richard stood and bowed deeply, noting with satisfaction the amazed expressions on many faces in the front rows. He had given them a taste of world-class pianism, exactly as he'd intended. After a brief intermission, during which the audience buzzed with excited conversation, Barbara returned to the stage, and now, both of our pianists will perform Franz Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2. First, Ms. Lily Tran. Lily returned to the stage, her expression more serious now. The Hungarian Rhapsody was a different beast from the Debussy, a technical showpiece that required both virtuosity and interpretive flair. Richard watched closely, certain that the piece's difficulties would expose the limits of her abilities. She began the slow, dramatic introduction with a rubato that immediately established her approach. This would not be a note-for-note reproduction of the score, but an interpretation that honored Liszt's famously theatrical performance style. As she moved into the frisca, the faster section, her fingers flew across the keyboard with a precision that rivaled Richard's own. But it was more than technical skill. There was joy in her playing, a sense that she loved this music and wanted to share that love with the audience. When she reached the famous section that imitated the cymbalom, a Hungarian hammered dulcimer, her touch became so delicate that Richard found himself wondering how she achieved such control. The most difficult passages, the ones Richard had been certain would trip her up, she handled with grace, occasionally taking a slightly slower tempo but never sacrificing the music's character. By the time she reached the thunderous conclusion, the audience was completely with her, erupting into applause before the final notes had fully faded. People rose to their feet, clapping enthusiastically. Richard saw Dr. Wilson in the third row, beaming with pride. A group of children near the front were jumping up and down with excitement. Lily stood, her face flushed with the exertion and emotion of her performance. She bowed deeply, then again before walking off stage, where Richard waited for his turn. "That was," he began, but found himself struggling for words. "Thank you for listening," she said simply, her eyes bright with the aftermath of performance. As Richard walked onto the stage for his turn at the Hungarian Rhapsody, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years before a performance: pressure. Real pressure? Not from critics or discerning audiences in Vienna or New York, but from the need to match something authentic he had just witnessed. He sat at the piano, adjusted the bench slightly, and placed his hands on the keys. The audience quieted, waiting. Richard took a deep breath and began to play. Richard's fingers pressed into the opening chords of the Hungarian Rhapsody with deliberate force. He knew this piece intimately, had performed it in concert halls around the world to standing ovations. Tonight would be no different, despite Lily's surprisingly competent rendition. He approached the piece with textbook precision, each note exactly as Liszt had written it, each dynamic marking observed with scholarly accuracy. His technique was flawless, built from thousands of hours of practice and refinement. He could play this piece in his sleep, and tonight he would show this small-town audience what true mastery sounded like. But as he moved deeper into the performance, something felt off. The notes were perfect, his timing impeccable, yet he could sense a subtle shift in the room. The audience was attentive but not enraptured. They had leaned forward during Lily's performance, hanging on each phrase. Now they sat respectfully upright, appreciative but not moved. Richard pushed harder. adding more power to the dramatic sections, more speed to the virtuosic runs. His fingers flew across the keys with machine-like accuracy. This was what had won him acclaim on 3 continents. This technical brilliance, this absolute control. Halfway through the piece, Richard glanced briefly at the audience. In the front row, the children who had cheered so enthusiastically for Lily watched him with wide eyes, impressed by his speed and volume, but not connecting with the music. Dr. Wilson's expression was harder to read, a mixture of pride and something else. Disappointment, perhaps? The thought sent an unexpected pang through Richard's chest. He had always valued his former teacher's opinion, even after outgrowing his instruction. Richard turned his focus back to the piano, trying to recapture the flow of the music. He was playing perfectly. Why wasn't it having the same effect as Lily's performance? He reached the famous cymbalom section, executing the tricky repeated notes with crisp articulation, but even to his own ears, it sounded mechanical compared to the living, breathing quality Lily had brought to the same passage. For the first time in years, Richard felt himself becoming unsettled during a performance. A drop of sweat rolled down his temple despite the hall's perfect climate control. He hadn't come this far, achieved this level of success, to be overshadowed by a small-town piano teacher, regardless of where she'd studied briefly years ago. As he approached the final section, Richard abandoned some of his careful control, pushing the tempo, adding more dramatic pauses, attempting to infuse the music with the passion he'd heard in Lily's playing. It was a departure from his usual approach, and his fingers, trained for precision rather than spontaneity, felt strangely uncoordinated. He finished with a flourish, the final chord ringing through the concert hall. The audience applauded enthusiastically. It had been an impressive performance by any standard. But they didn't leap to their feet as they had for Lily. The reaction was respectful admiration rather than emotional connection. Richard stood and bowed, his smile fixed in place while his mind raced. He had played better than Lily from a technical standpoint. He was certain of that. His training, experience, and natural ability were superior. Yet something had been missing, something he couldn't quite name. Barbara returned to the stage, beaming. What a remarkable evening of music. Let's thank both our pianists once more. Lily Tran and Richard Hall. She gestured toward the wings, and Lily walked back onto the stage. Richard moved to join her at center stage, and they bowed together as the audience applauded warmly. The festival committee decided not to frame tonight as a competition. Barbara continued. Music is subjective after all, and we've been treated to 2 very different but equally valid interpretations of Liszt's masterpiece. Equally valid. The phrase grated on Richard. He had spent his life becoming the best, rising above others. Equality had never been his goal. However, Barbara added, we did invite a special guest to offer some thoughts. Richard watched with surprise as Dr. Wilson made his way to the stage. His former teacher walked slowly, his hair much whiter than Richard remembered, but his posture still straight and his eyes still sharp. I've had the privilege of teaching both of these fine pianists, Dr. Wilson said, his voice carrying easily despite his age. Richard for 3 years in his teens, and Lily from her childhood until she left for Juilliard. Richard glanced at Lily, wondering why this connection had never been mentioned to him. Richard's technique has always been extraordinary, Dr. Wilson continued. His dedication to perfection set him apart from an early age. Lily, meanwhile, had something different, an intuitive understanding of music's emotional heart even as a child. The old teacher looked between them with genuine affection. Tonight I heard Richard's perfection and Lily's heart. Both are necessary for truly great music. Perhaps the lesson for us all is that neither exists in isolation. Richard felt an unexpected tightness in his chest. It wasn't the unqualified praise he was accustomed to receiving, yet coming from Dr. Wilson it carried weight. After the formal portion concluded, audience members gathered in the reception area. Richard found himself surrounded by admirers, many asking for autographs on their programs. He signed them mechanically, one eye watching the larger crowd that had formed around Lily. The children from her community center classes had rushed her with handmade cards. She knelt to their level, accepting each one with genuine appreciation. Several older people waited to speak with her as well, including an elderly woman in a wheelchair who clasped Lily's hand with tears in her eyes. Mr. Hall? Richard turned to find a middle-aged woman waiting patiently. Yes? I just wanted to say your performance was technically brilliant. I've never heard anyone play so perfectly. Thank you, he replied, waiting for more praise. But when Ms. Tran played, the woman continued, I remembered why I fell in love with music as a girl. That doesn't happen often anymore. She smiled kindly and moved away before Richard could respond. He stood there, program pen still in hand, feeling strangely hollow despite the room full of people who had come to hear him play. A familiar voice spoke from behind him. Still signing autographs, I see. Richard turned to find Dr. Wilson. People expect it. The old teacher nodded. The burden of fame. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the ongoing reception. You taught her well, Richard said finally. I gave her fundamentals. She already had the heart, just as you already had the discipline when you came to me. Dr. Wilson paused. You know, she was offered a position with the Boston Symphony after Juilliard. Richard's eyebrows rose. Boston, I had no idea. She turned it down to come home when her mother was diagnosed with cancer. Spent 3 years caring for her until the end. Richard watched Lily across the room, seeing her differently. And she never went back? To performing, I mean. Dr. Wilson shook his head. She said she'd found something more meaningful in teaching. The community center program was her idea, bringing music to children who couldn't afford lessons. But to give up a career like that, was it given up or exchanged for something else? The old teacher patted Richard's shoulder. Success takes many forms, Richard. You found yours. She found hers. As Dr. Wilson walked away, Richard remained standing alone despite the crowded room. The afterglow of performance, usually so satisfying, felt dim tonight. He had played perfectly, yet something had been missing. The very quality that had made Lily's playing so affecting. Barbara approached with a glass of champagne. Quite a night. The local paper wants photos of both of you together for tomorrow's edition. Richard nodded absently, his eyes still on Lily as she spoke animatedly with a group of her adult students. She's something special, isn't she? Barbara said, following his gaze. Everyone loves Lily, not just for her playing, though that was extraordinary tonight. It's who she is. The comment struck Richard oddly. In his world, people were loved for what they did, not who they were. Critics praised his playing. Audiences applauded his performances, but did anyone care about Richard, the person beyond Richard the pianist? I should speak with her, he said suddenly. Barbara looked surprised but pleased. Of course. I'll get those photos organized. Richard made his way across the room, nodding politely to those who congratulated him as he passed. When he reached Lily, she was kneeling to hug a small boy who clutched a toy piano. I'm going to practice every day like you said, the boy was telling her earnestly. That's all anyone can ask, Lily replied. Even 5 minutes matters if you do it with your whole heart. She looked up as Richard approached, and the circle of people around her quieted, eyeing him with curious and, in some cases, wary expressions. Ms. Tran, Richard said formally. Your performance was impressive. Lily stood, straightening her dress. Thank you, Mr. Hall. Coming from you, that means a great deal. The sincerity in her voice made his carefully crafted compliment feel small. Barbara wants photos of us together, he said, then added awkwardly, for the paper. Of course. Lily turned to excuse herself from her group, promising to return shortly. As they walked toward where the photographer was setting up, Richard found himself uncharacteristically searching. The days following the piano duel left Richard feeling strangely unsettled. He had extended his stay in Millfield, telling his agent he needed a short break before his next engagement in Chicago. The truth was more complicated. He couldn't leave town with this strange sense of unfinished business. The local newspaper had run a glowing review of the event, praising both pianists but giving special attention to Lily's soul-stirring interpretation and rare gift for emotional connection. Richard had been described as technically flawless and brilliantly precise compliments he would have treasured before, but now they felt like confirmation of what had been lacking in his playing. On the third morning after the performance, Richard found himself driving to the community center where Lily taught. He had learned her schedule from Barbara, who had been surprised but pleased by his interest. It was Saturday, the day Lily taught her free classes to children whose families couldn't afford private lessons. Richard sat in his rental car for several minutes, watching parents drop off children of various ages. Some carried sheet music folders, others clutched small keyboards. All of them looked excited to be there. Finally, he got out and walked inside. The building was older but well-maintained, with colorful children's artwork decorating the walls. He followed the sound of pianos to a large room divided into practice spaces with movable partitions. Lily moved among the stations, spending time with each student. She knelt beside a young boy who was struggling with a simple piece, guiding his hands gently over the keys. Her patience seemed endless, her encouragement genuine. "Mr. Hall?" Richard turned to find a teenage girl looking at him with wide eyes. "I saw you at the concert," she continued excitedly. "You were amazing. What are you doing here?" Before he could answer, other children noticed him. Soon he was surrounded by young faces full of curiosity and awe. "Can you play as fast as in the videos? Do your fingers get tired? Have you played for the Queen?" Richard found himself smiling genuinely as he fielded their questions. Children had never been part of his world. His performances were in venues with strict age minimums, his master classes for serious adult students only. Lily approached, looking surprised but not displeased to see him. "Children, let's give Mr. Hall some space," she said gently. "He's our guest." "Actually," Richard said, surprising himself, "I wondered if I might observe your class, or perhaps even help if that wouldn't be disruptive." The children erupted in excited chatter. Lily's expression softened into a smile. "We'd be honored," she said, "though I should warn you our standards here are rather different from the concert stage." For the next 2 hours, Richard experienced music education from a perspective he'd never considered. Lily's approach emphasized joy and personal expression alongside proper technique. When a child played a piece imperfectly but with obvious enjoyment, she celebrated their emotional connection to the music before gently correcting their mistakes. Richard found himself assigned to work with 2 intermediate students who were preparing a simple duet. They were nervous around him at first, but his genuine interest in their progress soon put them at ease. "Loosen your wrist a bit," he suggested to one. "Like you're shaking hands with the piano, not fighting it." The boy tried again, his playing immediately more fluid. "That's it," Richard encouraged, surprised by how satisfying the small improvement felt. After the classes ended and the children had gone, Lily invited Richard to join her for coffee at the small shop across the street. "You're good with them," she said as they waited for their drinks. "Have you taught before?" Richard shook his head. "Only master classes for conservatory students." "Nothing like this. What brought you here today?" Lily asked directly, her eyes curious but kind. Richard considered deflecting the question but found he wanted to be honest. "I'm not entirely sure. Something about our performances the other night has been bothering me." "You played beautifully," Lily said. "Your technique is extraordinary." "But that's just it," Richard replied, the realization crystallizing as he spoke. "It was all technique. You played with something more, something I used to have, but somewhere along the way. Lost?" Lily studied him thoughtfully. "When was the last time you played just for yourself? Not for an audience or critics or recordings?" Richard couldn't remember. Every practice session for years had been focused on upcoming performances, on maintaining his reputation, on technical perfection. "Music was my whole life once," he said quietly. "Now it's my career." "There's a difference," Lily nodded. "I almost lost that connection too at Juilliard. The pressure to be perfect, to compete constantly, it started to kill what I loved about music. Then your mother got sick, and you came back here," Richard said, remembering what Dr. Wilson had told him. "Yes. At first I thought I was giving up everything, but sitting beside her bed playing the simple pieces she loved, I found something I'd been missing." Lily's eyes grew distant with memory. "After she died, I could have gone back, but I realized I'd found a different path. Teaching children who bang out chopsticks instead of performing with world-class orchestras." Richard couldn't keep the incredulity from his voice entirely. Lily wasn't offended. Seeing a child connect with music for the first time, it's like watching someone fall in love. There's nothing quite like it. They talked for nearly 2 hours, their coffee growing cold as Richard shared stories from his touring life and Lily described her experiences, teaching everyone from eager 5-year-olds to retirees fulfilling lifelong dreams of playing piano. "I have to ask," Richard said finally, "don't you miss it? The applause, the recognition, Knowing you're among the best in the world? Lily considered this. Sometimes. But I've found something that feeds my soul more consistently. The applause fades, Richard. The reviews are forgotten. What stays is how the music makes you feel, and how it connects you to others. As they parted ways outside the coffee shop, Richard found himself saying, I'm playing a short recital tomorrow afternoon at the festival's closing event. I'd be honored if you'd come. I wouldn't miss it, Lily replied with a warm smile. That evening, alone in his hotel room, Richard sat at the piano and played without sheet music, without a planned program, without thinking about technique or audience expectations. He played pieces he hadn't touched in years, simple Schumann works he'd learned as a child, jazz standards his first teacher had loved, even improvising in a way he hadn't allowed himself since conservatory. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Richard played purely for the joy of it. The small recital hall was only half full for the festival's closing event. Richard had requested a more intimate space than the main concert hall. He had also made an unusual request of Barbara, who had been confused but willing to accommodate it. Richard walked onto the stage in a simple dark suit, nodded to the audience, and sat at the piano. He spotted Lily in the third row sitting beside Dr. Wilson. Thank you for coming today, Richard said, breaking with his usual practice of letting his playing speak for itself. I've made a slight change to the program. Instead of the pieces listed, I'd like to play something that has special meaning for me. He began with Schumann's Traumerei, a piece often considered too simple for professional recitals. He played it with a tenderness he hadn't shown in years, allowing the gentle melody to breathe and sing. Next came Debussy's Reverie, another piece typically reserved for students rather than virtuosos. As Richard played, he focused not on technical perfection but on the emotion behind each phrase, the way each harmony shifted the mood. He finished with Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, one of the first advanced pieces he had mastered as a teenager. His playing was different now, still precise, still skilled, but with an emotional openness that had been missing from his Hungarian Rhapsody performance. When the final note faded, there was a moment of silence before the audience broke into warm applause. Richard stood and bowed, his eyes finding Lily, who was smiling with what looked like pride. There's one more piece I'd like to share today, Richard said, when the applause quieted, but I need some help with it. He gestured toward Lily. Ms. Tran, would you join me for a duet? There was a murmur of surprise and delight from the audience. Lily looked momentarily stunned before making her way to the stage. I hope you know Heart and Soul, Richard whispered as she sat beside him on the bench. It's the only duet I could count on us both knowing without rehearsal. Lily laughed softly. The first duet everyone learns. Perfect. They began to play the simple, familiar piece that countless beginners had learned over the years. Richard took the left-hand part, Lily the melody. As they played, Richard added flourishes to the basic pattern, and Lily responded with her own improvisations. The childlike piece transformed into something joyful and unexpectedly moving. The audience broke into delighted applause when they finished. Richard and Lily stood and bowed together, both smiling genuinely. Thank you, Richard said to her quietly as they left the stage. For what? For reminding me why I started playing in the first place. 2 months later, Richard sat in his New York apartment, reading an email from Barbara. The Millfield Music Festival was planning next year's events, and wondered if he would consider a return engagement, not as a solo performer, but to lead a weekend of master classes for young musicians, with a focus on musical expression over technical perfection. The old Richard would have declined immediately, seeing it as beneath his stature. Instead, he found himself typing an acceptance, along with a suggestion that Lily might co-teach the classes with him. On his piano sat a stack of sheet music he hadn't touched in years, alongside brochures from several music education programs in underserved communities. A letter from his agent lay unopened, likely containing offers for his usual round of prestigious concerts. For the first time in decades, Richard was considering a different measure of success, not by the grandeur of the venues where he performed, but by the hearts he might touch with music's true power, or words.